I'm back. Okay, so I started this script about sadness in fiction, and it ended up taking like 16 minutes of recording. So I'm gonna just split it into two parts, and then you'll eventually get the second part by like December of this year. Okay, so I'm not trying to be like some I am 14 and this is deep type stuff, but I'm gonna be honest, I think sadness is definitely an inevitable part of our life. I mean, 1 in 15 people you encounter on a day-to-day basis are statistically likely to suffer from depression, right? Which is like the literal worst form of sadness. According to the entire scope of psychology itself, this can cause low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin from the quick reabsorption of the setting cell. And although it's in my part influenced by the genetical size of the 5-HTT gene, being SS, SL, and LL, where SS is the most vulnerable to sadness, you would still get a temporary or worse permanent drop in mood, energy, and motivation. So why am I bringing this topic up? My point is, I feel like while it's easy to pinpoint the blame of sadness on external factors like the competitivity of our modern life or the downright horrendous influence of social media, which I mean, don't get me wrong, I believe they still have every right to be part of this discussion, a lot of people tend to discard or neglect just how much control we have in preventing ourselves from becoming sad. Sadness is in part influenced by how pessimistic or optimistic we see the world, right? Which is a skill we can fully and consciously control. This is why you often see some students crying over getting a B+ on the exam, whilst others just literally do not care. One just has a pessimistic and disappointed view, while the other just has an optimistic view, who is glad that they've tried their best. These claims are not baseless, by the way. That has been tested since 1955 by the Ellis ABC model. Yes, ABC model. According to a study, approaching the same saddening activating event with rational belief would lead to a positive consequences, while that of an irrational belief would lead to a negative consequences. One of the many ways we can reduce the pessimism of our world now is through fiction. Here, a variety of artists have an opportunity to share their collective worldview, beliefs, and perspective through entertaining stories and interesting characters, to which we can unconsciously absorb and collect. It's a really beautiful process, like in my opinion, and I believe that these type of sadness portrayed in fiction are not really used as bait for cash grabs. It is not a manipulative tool used for the, weaponizing our deepest inner feelings. I feel like that's cap. Rather, it is there to motivate us, showing us that there are other characters, albeit fictional, who are going through a similar situation as us. It is a way for us to understand the different pessimistic and optimistic worldview these fictional characters face, shared by artists who have been or are going through tough times. Through this, we can unconsciously absorb and broaden our perspectives, worldview, and decide our own moral lesson we want to take when we inevitably face a new saddening activating event. By this account, I feel like sadness in fiction matters, and therefore my point is solved. So without further ado, what are the techniques artists use to show their sadness in their stories? How do they do it? Is an elaborate plot even required for such tasks? Well, let's start with the first chapter that I'm diving into this video, which is creating an attachment between the consumers and the characters. Okay, so in my opinion, I believe that characters are the building blocks of how fiction portrays their sadness. Because sure, you can execute a brilliant and sad plot where holocaustic levels of tragedy strikes to the characters, but I mean like, if you have no attachment to the characters that are receiving such strikes, then like, why should you feel sad about it? After all, they're not really real human beings, they're just fictional characters. So I believe that the first step every artist does when they're creating a sad piece of fiction is to first create an attachment between the viewer and the characters. Because by doing so, this strays the brain further from our ever-analytical frontal lobe, and instead diverts it to the limbic system, where we start to evoke emotional responses. In essence, our brain by that point would be tricked into believing and attaching ourselves with the fictional characters, which starts to impact us emotionally when bad stuff happens to them. So how do artists make us feel attached to their characters, right? Aside from the basic answer of, character development and consistent personality, another factor that contributes is surprisingly setting, I feel. Because if you make the setting more realistic and comparable to our world, our brain is tricked into believing that the story takes place in real life, which makes us feel attached to the fictional characters that conduct themselves in these settings. I think that another technique is using character relatability, because, the more relatable the characters are, the more attached we feel to them. So after the artists have successfully established this bond between the viewer and the characters, I believe this is when they start to strike a depressing and melancholic moment to them as a way to, make us feel sad. But how do they do it, right? Personally, I believe that a depressing moment is tied to our relatability and experiences. Hence why this chapter is called Characters and Relatability. Yeah. So, for example, a sad breakup moment could be depressing to teenagers given their relatability and experiences, but rarely would it be depressing to, primary schoolers because they don't risk. This is for a similar reason as to why a sad family moment is always almost depressing to basically everyone, because everyone has a family, so it's relatable to a majority. With this in mind, I think that a smart artist trying to portray fictional sadness to a mass audience would therefore tend to find, a relatable moment where a large portion of their consumer could have experienced it. So as an example, let's just look at Inception, right? Although I'm not personally a big fan of movies because of my horrendous and concerningly low levels of attention span, Inception is still objectively a great way in which Christopher Nolan had effectively displayed sadness in his mostly action blockbuster story. Here, although the movie hooks us by the imaginative and impressive concept of invading dreams, the real attachment to the characters in the story is derived from the mostly realistic setting, great dialogues, and most importantly relatable characters which hooks us into the world. After believing and attaching ourselves to Cobb, did we start to feel sad for him when at the end of the movie, he quite deliberately showed us that he doesn't care whether the reality is true or not. He just wants to spend time with his children, right? Here, the core principle is to make the viewer feel attached to the characters, then strike a relatable sad moment. In this case, a sad family moment to said characters. In this case of Inception, I think it worked out pretty well objectively, so this is a very good case study.